The Harvard professor thought she was about to make Barron Trump look foolish, but within seconds she was the one struggling for words. The professor, known for adding her political opinions to math lessons, believed she had full control over the classroom. She didn't realize she was about to face a student who could solve equations faster than she could finish her insult. Could she really outthink someone who had been trained in advanced mathematics since childhood? Tune in, because what happened next made the professor's entire life crumble to its core within seconds. The Harvard professor who made the worst mistake. The event was high profile, packed with influential names who expected nothing less than excellence. Among them sat a young man, quiet but self-assured, unbothered by the noise around him. He wasn't there to impress anyone, he was simply there, present, absorbing the moment. Unfortunately, someone else in the room had a very different plan. A Harvard professor known for her sharp tongue had her sights set on an easy target. Before we even get into what happened next, one thing is clear. Her arrogance would backfire in a way she never saw coming, and this won't be the only thing that will leave you stunned. At first, her remarks were lighthearted, meant to amuse the crowd, but as she noticed the reactions around her, she turned it up a notch. Her words dripped with condescension as she spoke louder, making sure everyone in the room knew exactly what she thought of a certain former president and his family. She thought she was untouchable, that everyone in attendance would agree. But she had no idea that her overconfidence was leading her straight toward a disaster that she wouldn't be able to talk her way out of. The energy in the room started to shift. What had begun as casual laughter was now mixed with uncomfortable glances and tense silence. Not everyone was entertained anymore. The air felt thick, charged with something she hadn't noticed before. And then, without raising his voice, Barron Trump, the young man she had just mocked, finally responded. His words were precise, cutting through the noise like a blade. The professor, who had spent her career tearing people down with clever remarks, suddenly found herself at a loss for words. Her smug expression faltered. She had expected the usual reaction: nervous chuckles, heads nodding in agreement, validation from those around her. But the silence that followed made it painfully clear that this wasn't just another joke at someone's expense. Then came the truth. The professor had just publicly insulted someone far more influential than she had realized. The room erupted in whispers, shock rippling through the crowd. Faces that had once shown amusement now held something else: disbelief, embarrassment, maybe even pity. She had just made the mistake of her career, and the fallout was about to hit hard. For the first time in a long time, she had nothing to say. Just moments ago, she had spoken with such authority, so sure of her position in the room. But now her words had vanished. Among the guests, someone who had remained quiet this whole time finally stepped forward. Their face gave nothing away, but their decision was clear. The professor, once so confident in her own cleverness, now stood frozen, fully aware of what was about to happen. There was no taking back what had been said, no way to undo the damage she had just caused. Everything happened so fast that she barely had time to process it. The person addressing her didn't raise their voice, didn't argue, didn't give her a chance to defend herself. The decision was made. Before she could fully grasp what was happening, she was being led out of the event. Step by step, the weight of her own arrogance crashed down on her. The doors closed behind her, and suddenly she was outside. The air felt colder than before, or maybe it was just the realization of what she had lost sinking in. Her time in that space among those people was over. No debate, no second chances. She had spoken without thinking, and now she had to live with the consequences. Inside, the night continued as if nothing had happened. Conversations resumed, glasses clinked, and the moment smoothed over like ripples fading in a pond. The same people who had laughed at her jokes minutes ago now acted as if they had never known her. Some looked away, pretending they hadn't witnessed her downfall. Others, who had once hung on her every word, suddenly had no interest in acknowledging her presence at all. Just like that, she had gone from being the woman everyone wanted to listen to someone they couldn't distance themselves from fast enough. She was no longer part of the conversation. She had made herself irrelevant. And what happened to Barron? He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or even glance in the direction of the exit. He simply carried on, as calm and composed as he had been before. It was as if the entire ordeal had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, something not even worth his attention. And that, more than any angry outburst, more than any insult in return, was what made it sting the most. If Barron had argued, if he had looked pleased at the professor's humiliation, maybe the professor could have told herself she had still won in some way. Maybe she could have found a way to spin it in her favor. But the silence, the complete lack of concern, that was what truly sealed her fate. She had misjudged everything. She had assumed her words were harmless, just jokes meant to entertain. But respect isn't given just because someone demands it. It's something earned, something that has to be given in order to be received. She had crossed a line without realizing it, and now she had to deal with the consequences. You never know who's really in the room with you. Sometimes the person you think you can mock is the one holding all the power. And when that realization hits too late, there's nothing left to do but face the truth. The impossible equation challenge. The classroom felt like a battlefield, everyone waiting for the first strike. Dr. Markham's glare was sharp as she took slow, deliberate steps toward the whiteboard, marker in hand. "All right, Mr. Trump," she said, voice dripping with challenge. "Since you have such strong opinions about mathematics, let's put that confidence to the test." The marker screeched against the board as she wrote, numbers and symbols piling up in a monstrous equation that stretched across the surface. A few students exchanged nervous glances, some even whispering. This wasn't just difficult, this was the kind of problem that sent even seasoned mathematicians into a cold sweat. She turned, smirking as she tapped the marker against the board. "Go ahead," she said, arms crossed. "Show us how it's done. Unless, of course, you'd rather sit down and keep talking about things you don't understand." The words stung, and the challenge was clear: humiliation or victory. The class held its breath, waiting for the inevitable embarrassment. But Barron didn't flinch. He stood up, calm as ever, and walked toward the board. His expression was unreadable, his movements steady. Dr. Markham's smirk widened. This was going to be good. She had deliberately chosen this problem, knowing full well that it required methods far beyond anything taught in the course. There was no way he could pull this off. Then Barron spoke, his voice even and controlled. "Before I begin, I'd like to point out that this problem has more than one approach. Would you prefer I use the standard method or a more efficient solution based on original work by Leibniz?" The room fell silent. Even she hesitated for a moment. "You've read Leibniz's original work?" she asked, the confidence in her voice faltering slightly. "Yes, in the original German. The translations lose some of the finer details." Barron didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The message was clear. This wasn't a bluff. He knew exactly what he was doing. He turned back to the board and without hesitation began to write. His movements were precise, his steps deliberate. The problem that had looked insurmountable moments ago now seemed to unravel under his pen. It wasn't just that he was solving it, he was explaining every step as he went, making it look almost effortless. The class watched in stunned silence, phones slowly being raised to record what was quickly becoming something more than just a math lesson. This first step, Barron continued, was first introduced by Euler in the 1700s. It simplifies what appears to be a complicated integral into something much more manageable. His hand moved across the board, the solution unfolding like a perfectly orchestrated plan. Even students who had struggled with basic calculus before found themselves following along. Dr. Markham, arms still crossed, leaned slightly forward, her eyes darting between the board and Barron's face. She was trying to find a flaw, some mistake she could call out, but none appeared. Barron wasn't just solving the problem, he was teaching it in a way that made more sense than any lecture she had ever given. "Now," he said, nearing the final steps, "we have two ways to proceed. The traditional method would take up another full board, but there's a more elegant approach using a lesser-known principle from Leibniz's notes." He turned to face her. "Which would you prefer?" Her expression was unreadable, her earlier smugness completely gone. The class, still recording, waited for her response. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the silence. "Could we see both?" It was Sarah Chin, one of the quieter students, her voice hesitant but firm. This actually makes more sense than how it was explained in the textbook. Barron smiled, nodding. Of course. He turned back to the board and continued. She remained silent, watching as the student she had intended to embarrass took complete control of her classroom. The weight of the moment hung in the air. This wasn't just about solving an equation, it was about proving a point. By the time Barron finished, the entire board was filled, but his work was as clear and clean as a textbook example. He set the marker down and turned back to the class. And that, he said simply, is how it's done. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then slowly, a few students began to clap. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew. The energy in the room shifted. Phones were still raised, capturing every moment. The classroom debate had already changed everything, but when Dean Richardson walked in, things took an even bigger turn. A professor's authority put to the test. The classroom door burst open with a loud bang, and in stormed Dean Richardson, a close supporter of her political stances. He barely took a breath before announcing, "Linda, we need you for an emergency faculty meeting. It's about the curriculum changes." The timing was absolutely terrible, or perhaps perfect depending on how one looked at it. She turned to her students, attempting to wrap up the session. "We'll continue this demonstration another time," she said, trying to maintain authority, but before she could take a step, Barron spoke up. "Professor, you gave me a public challenge. You asked me to solve this in front of everyone," Barron said, his voice steady but firm. His words sent a wave of murmurs through the class, and even the dean hesitated. Leaving now wouldn't set the right example about academic integrity, would it? Silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. Dean Richardson's expression darkened, his mouth tightening as if preparing for a scolding. "Young man, are you implying—" "I'm not implying anything, sir," Barron cut in, polite but unwavering. "I'm simply stating that Dr. Markham wanted to make a point about privilege and merit, and I accepted the challenge. The only question is, will she follow through?" The weight of the moment was undeniable. Some students had their phones out, capturing what was clearly turning into something bigger than a classroom debate. She glanced at the marker in her hand, then at the equation on the board, the same problem she had picked to supposedly expose a lack of ability. But now it was her own competence under the microscope. The dean, who had arrived as an authority figure, now found himself just another spectator. The tension grew unbearable. Barron, in a move that left everyone breathless, held the marker out to Dr. Markham. "Or perhaps," he said, a quiet challenge in his tone, "you'd prefer to solve it first. After all, you've made it clear that knowledge is what really matters. As our professor, surely you can walk us through the solution?" The classroom fell into a stunned silence. Her fingers tightened around the marker as if it had suddenly turned to lead. Her mind raced. How had this happened? How had the moment she designed to humiliate one student flipped into an interrogation of her own knowledge? The presence of the dean wasn't a shield anymore. It was a witness, a judge. Phones stayed lifted, capturing every moment. She started, then faltered. Her eyes darted to the board. The equation wasn't impossible, but under this kind of scrutiny, every second felt like a lifetime. Barron, unshaken, extended an olive branch. "We could solve it together. Collaboration often leads to better understanding." There was no mockery in his tone, no arrogance, just a genuine offer. But that made it even worse. Dr. Markham's pride wouldn't allow her to take it. Her jaw clenched. "This is absurd," she snapped, tossing the marker onto the desk. "This entire stunt is nothing but a privileged student trying to undermine my authority." The class collectively exhaled, but the moment of tension didn't dissolve. It shifted. Now it was Barron's turn to pick up the pieces, or rather the marker. He bent down, retrieved it, and met Dr. Markham's fiery gaze with cool determination. "No," he said, voice unwavering, "this is about moving forward." And then, without another word, he turned to the board and did something that would leave the room breathless. In less than 5 minutes, he completed both solutions, the traditional method and an alternative approach. His movements were quick, precise, and completely unshaken. As he wrote the final number, the class exploded into applause. Even the dean couldn't hide his astonishment. But this wasn't the moment that would change everything. That came next. Dr. Markham stood there, her face drained of color, her carefully built reputation starting to crumble. Barron wasn't finished, though. He stepped back, facing both his professor and the dean. "Mathematics doesn't care about politics, backgrounds, or biases," he stated, gesturing at the board. "It only cares about truth. And when we let personal agendas cloud our judgment, we miss the opportunity to grow." The dean cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Trump, while your mathematical abilities are impressive, you must understand that—" Before he could finish, a voice rang from the back of the room. "That what?" It was Michael Chin, a quiet scholarship student who rarely spoke. "That we should learn less math because of someone's political beliefs?" The words cut through the air like a blade. And just like that, the classroom, the faculty, and the institution itself were forced to face a new reality. One where knowledge, not authority, would decide who held the real power. What started as a classroom argument didn't stay in the room for long. Soon, more people heard about it, and the whole school was watching. One lesson that redefined the classroom. Dr. Markham's class was supposed to be about calculus, but instead it had turned into something else entirely. Students were getting frustrated. One stood up and said they came here to learn math, not to get a lecture about privilege. Others nodded, their patience running out. The air in the room was thick with tension, and for a moment it seemed like Dr. Markham was losing control of the class. Then a student did something unexpected. He spoke up, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise. He acknowledged that Dr. Markham knew a lot about math, but maybe they should stick to that instead of these other discussions. He even offered to help other students outside of class, blending theory with real problem solving. It was a lifeline, a way for Dr. Markham to keep control without backing down completely. The room fell silent, waiting to see what she would do. Dr. Markham hesitated. Her whole approach had been about challenging privilege and making students think about more than just numbers. But now, faced with the reality of their frustration, she had to make a choice. Slowly, she admitted she had been wrong. She had spent too much time focusing on one issue and had ignored what she was actually there to teach. The shift was subtle, but it changed everything. For the first time, she really saw her students for who they were, not just who she assumed they were. Then came the real shock. Students outside the class had started gathering. Word had spread fast. People were watching the drama unfold in real time, posting videos and reactions online. Soon, a crowd formed outside, holding signs with phrases like "teach math, not politics," and "merit over bias." The situation was about to explode into something much bigger than just a classroom debate. But the student who had spoken up wasn't done yet. Instead of letting things spiral, he walked to the door and spoke to the crowd. If they were here to learn, they should come inside. And just like that, students poured in, filling every seat and standing along the walls. Dr. Markham watched, stunned. She had been struggling to keep students engaged, and now, thanks to him, the room was packed with eager learners. What happened next became legend. He took the marker and turned the class back to what it was supposed to be: math. For the next hour, students listened, asked questions, and actually learned something useful. It wasn't about privilege or politics anymore. It was about numbers, equations, and real-world applications. And for the first time in a long time, Dr. Markham felt like she was truly teaching. The story spread across campus like wildfire. People expected it to be about a professor getting humiliated, but instead it became something else. Enrollment in advanced calculus skyrocketed. Dr. Markham, humbled by the experience, changed her approach. She went back to focusing on what she loved, teaching math. The student who had spoken up, true to his word, led study sessions and helped others bridge the gap between theory and practice. Was this professor trying to teach math, or was she using her position to push an agenda? And did she ever expect Barron Trump to outshine her so easily? Tell us what you think, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.